Hi, great. Welcome this afternoon to our 4 o'clock session. I'm so glad you can all join us this afternoon. We have another great session for you lined up now. I know you've been having a lot of different sessions already today, but the momentum is still going, and we're going through till midnight tonight. So welcome, and please do join us for this next 50 minutes. We have got a great, fantastic discussion lined up for you here, which is all talking about social value and really talking about our London model and how we can create social value through public procurement for our cities everywhere. So we have got this afternoon myself, I'm Jo Parkin, and I'm one of our UK chapter co-chairs, and my other co-chair, Seb Butt. And then we have two fantastic speakers, Tim Rudin, who is Head of Responsible Procurement for Transport for London, and Guy Battle, who heads up the Social Value Portal. So without further ado, we'll talk you through the agenda and what we've got planned. Next slide, please, Tim. Okay, so we will do a brief introduction in terms of SPPs, if you haven't already heard it enough this afternoon and today, but we will just explain our links for UK as well. And then we will talk through the Greater London Authority Groups programme, how we can actually tailor a social value measurement framework to meet a city's needs, such as London, case studies, successes, lessons learned, what you can actually take away from this, what you can reflect on this. Always important for all of us as procurement professionals as what we can do to actually make sense and take it back into our day jobs from this. And then we'll follow by a Q&A session. We do also have a UK booth that we can move to afterwards if anyone would like to carry on chatting after this session. Next slide, please. Okay, Seb, would you like to just talk briefly about SPP?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jo. As Jo said, welcome everyone to the session today. We were very excited as the UK chapter to be hosting this session with Tim and Guy. Hopefully many of you already know what the SPP is here to do. We're all focused on sustainability within procurement. Sustainability in supply chains is our responsibility, and we all want to build towards a sustainable future for people and planet. If you've not already become an ambassador, please do. And if we can go to the next slide. We also want to let you know that the UK chapter does have a LinkedIn group, so do connect with Jo or myself on LinkedIn. We'd be happy to navigate you through to the LinkedIn group where we'll be sharing resources. So for those of you based in the UK who'd love to join, please do so. For those of you who are elsewhere who want to find out more about sustainability within procurement in the UK, you're also welcome to join us as well.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a chat feature on the side and we have a Q&A feature. Please do post any questions that you want as we go along in the Q&A, and we can come to them as part of the discussion towards the end. So without further ado, let's get on to this afternoon's session then. Over to you, Tim.
Great, thanks very much, Jo. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Rudin, and I head the Greater London Authority Group Central Responsible Procurement team. The Greater London Authority Group is all of the bodies that sit under the control and authority of the Mayor of London. So that includes Transport for London, the Metropolitan Police Service, the London Fire Brigade, two development corporations in London, one in the Olympic Park, the one in Old Oakham Park Royal, and of course City Hall itself. We, across that Greater London Authority Group, GLA Group, we spend around upwards of £9 billion a year on procurements, and have perhaps 600 or 700 people who have a procurement role of one type or another, be it buying or contract management. So a lot of scope, a lot of opportunity, hence the establishment and implementation of a responsible procurement programme. So the GLA Group Responsible Procurement Programme really stems from the Mayor's Responsible Procurement Policy. And I'll point you to the top left there. The sort of subtitle of the policy in italics there is delivering social value through our supply chain. So it's really around the fact that we use responsible procurement as the mechanism to create social value within our procurements and through the relationships we have with our many suppliers. Responsible procurement policy has 5 key themes. These are represented on the slide here, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail just to give you a gist of what it is that we include within our responsible procurement program, what it is that we're trying to achieve. Starting with the first of the themes, which is improving supply chain diversity. We're really looking to promote diverse supply chains, and it's particularly focused on businesses led by women, people from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, and disabled people. We're looking to remove barriers to small and diverse businesses from entering our supply chains, and we're looking to increase our spend with SMEs. SMEs really are the lifeblood of the economy in London and elsewhere as well, and kind of in the wider world. Yet traditionally the public sector, and particularly, well, not perhaps particularly, but certainly we're aware of the fact that there are significant barriers for small and diverse businesses to contract with the public sector, particularly large organizations like ours. So we're really looking to understand what those barriers are and address them. But it's not just around having those organizations having an opportunity to contract directly with us, but it's also what sort of conditions do our tier ones have in place? How open are their procurement processes? Because ultimately, we're spending our money with our immediate tier one suppliers, but that filters down through the supply chain. And if SMEs perhaps might not be able to contract for large, let's say large infrastructure projects in our supply chain, but do they have opportunities to work within our supply chain at tiers 2, 3, 4, perhaps or below? So we're really looking to understand that and partnering with our large tier ones to bring more SMEs in across our supply chain. Next up, we have embedding fair and inclusive employment practices. And this is really around the fact that we really look to our suppliers to treat the workforce working on our contracts in the same way that we would treat our own immediate employees. So those people working for our suppliers, essentially working on our contracts, often working on our premises, on our projects. And it's really vital that our suppliers share our core values in terms of how those people are treated and their experience of working. So we want to employ a workforce that is representative of London's diversity. London is one of the most diverse cities in the world, and it's really vital that the people working, the workforce working on our contracts and projects is representative of that community, because that's the way in which we can best serve the communities, and ultimately that's what we're here for, be it through transport provision, policing, fire services, development. It's absolutely vital that that we are able to represent those communities that we're working within and for. We champion equality and diversity. The mayor's established something called the Good Work Standard, which is a certification that businesses can achieve when they meet a number of set criteria around providing good work for their employees. And one of the key aspects of that is around the London living wage. Anyone who's visited London, or certainly those of you who live or work here, will know how expensive it is. And so there's a London living wage above and beyond the UK national living wage, and actually well above the UK minimum wage, as sort of recognizing how expensive it is to live or work in London. And we require our supply chain to pay London living wage to all of the employees working on our contracts. Furthermore, we really encourage our suppliers to extend that provision to the wider workforce, not just those on our contracts, but actually to recognize the benefit of paying people a living wage in that wider context. The third theme of our policy is around enabling skills and training and employment opportunities. We're trying to do two things with this aspect of the policy. One is to address skills shortages in key industry sectors. So transport and engineering in particular, infrastructure, much of what TfL does, both in terms of building new infrastructure like Crossrail or Bank Station enhancement and other rail extensions, large infrastructure projects like the Silvertown Tunnel, and actually the day-to-day operation and maintenance of the network. All of that is put at risk by skills shortages, which are very acute at the moment in the UK in a wide number of sectors. Those of you who work in procurement may also have found it difficult to recruit recently. So these skills shortages are by no means limited to transport and engineering, but they are acutely felt, and they will lead directly to cost increases and to delays and putting at risk our ability to undertake new infrastructure projects. So we're looking to address these, but at the same time to also take that opportunity to address the underrepresentation of the workforce. So again, thinking particularly about Transport for London, the infrastructure and construction sectors, engineering, traditionally very male dominated, often by white males. So that's really missing a huge pool of talent, a huge opportunity with people from different backgrounds to fill these large number of skills gaps and really diversify the workforce, and again ensure that we're representing the city that we're working within. And we do this by including requirements into contracts for our suppliers to create skills and employment opportunities as a condition of doing contract with us. A key part of this is the overlap or the intersectionality with the environmental agenda around supporting green skills. That's something that it's really kind of an emerging agenda. We know that the decarbonisation agenda nationally will require quite a bit of upskilling of existing workforce and quite a few new roles coming in. So we really want to make sure that we're on the front foot and working with our supply chain to bring people in with those skills and make sure that they are we're seeing that succession coming through. Our fourth theme is around promoting ethical sourcing practices, and this is where we're really looking to both identify and mitigate the risk of labour abuses, including modern slavery, in our supply chain. This is relevant to both things that we're buying from perhaps the other side of the world, such as uniforms. Our uniforms are coming from places like China and India, and also very relevant to right here in London, where particularly construction sites, as well as perhaps large workforces such as in the cleaning sector, there's significant risks of modern slavery and forced labour. So we really need to work with our suppliers to make sure that they are understanding the risks in their supply chain with our assistance and being as transparent as possible, so that we can do everything we can to understand where those risks might be and mitigate the chances of these sorts of issues appearing in our supply chain. Finally, last but of course very much not least is the theme around improving environmental sustainability, which is a very large theme agenda, as you can imagine, one of 5 in our policy, but they're not equally weighted. Certainly this is a top priority. The Mayor has set a goal for London to be zero carbon by 2030, so well ahead of the national goal in the UK. And we really need to play our part. Supply chain emissions are very significant. Scope 3, I'm sure some of you in our session today will have been working on Scope 3 measurement. It's a big challenge, but we really need to work with our supply chain to address our Scope 3 emissions and reduce those. In the procurement space, circular economy and circular procurement is a key driver or key enabler for this. And the air quality agenda is also very key in London. That's a hot topic, you might say. So I just wanted to give you kind of a bit of a flavour of why responsible procurement. And this slide will just build up a few of the drivers here from the political side. We've got a London plan. The Mayor's got an environmental strategy. We've got the Mayor's got a diversity and inclusion strategy. We've got a London circular economy route map. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. 9 recovery missions, which stemmed from London's recovery from the pandemic. I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. And that led to something called the Anchor Institutions Charter, which the GLA group are part of. And finally, we have one example here of a number of policies coming through from the central government around procurement. This is around taking account of social value in the award of central government contracts, which we take on board as well. And the point I really wanted to make here was that thread from the very top level. Essentially, the Mayor of London is elected by the people of London to essentially improve the sort of well-being or the experience of living, perhaps working and also visiting London. And beneath, under the control of the Mayor, as I've said, are a number of these organisations, these bodies, transport, fire, policing, development corporations, and they're all here fundamentally well, they have specific remits, of course, providing a transport service, providing a police service. Fundamentally, they're there to improve the experience, as I say, of living, working or visiting London. And that's what we can achieve through our responsible procurement programme. We can use that £9 billion of spend to create that additional social value, those additional social value, which contribute directly to all of these policies and strategies that I've got up here on the screen. So it's not an added extra, in my view. It's very much a core part of what these public sector bodies, and what I think pretty much every public sector body, perhaps the world over, is there to do. You know, what are they fundamentally there to do? You know, fundamentally there to provide a public service and to improve essentially the well-being of the people within that particular area. So responsible procurement is a direct lever that the Mayor has to enable these strategies and policies. The slide's looking a little bit strange. I don't know if it's going to go. Slide, I'm not sure. Apologies. The slide's looking a little bit strange for me. I don't know if it's coming through for yourselves, but we have published an implementation plan in September of last year. This slide was meant to highlight the 5 kind of headline commitments within that plan. There's around 40 in total. I will post a link to the implementation plan for those who are interested in a chat a bit later on. So move on just to briefly mention the London Anchor Institutions Network. This really came out of the London's recovery initiatives coming from the COVID pandemic. And it was the coming together of a number of large bodies within London, so-called anchor institutions. So we've got the GLA Group, we've got London NHS London, we've got London City Airport, we've got some universities, London councils. So a really strong network of different organisations who can collectively commit to collaborative activity across a number of different work streams, and really create that additional magnified effect of working together, as well as apart from just working separately. There are 5 working groups within that institution, within that network, apologies, and one of those is around procurement. A number of initiatives here on this slide demonstrate what the procurement working group within the Anchor Institutions Network has been undertaking. I'll pull out a couple of here. The second from the top on the right-hand side is reserved contracts for SMEs. And there is a provision within the procurement regulations for the public authorities to reserve contracts below the threshold, which is around £170,000, reserve contracts below threshold specifically to be accessed by SMEs, by small and medium-sized enterprises. It's quite a powerful opportunity because it means that when you're letting a contract, you're not just addressing barriers, you're not just making these contracts more attractive and more available for SMEs, you're actually being certain that when you finish that procurement process, a small or diverse business will be the successful supplier. You do need to be confident that the market is there. Procurers, as I'm sure many of you will know, like nothing worse than going through a procurement process and having it be unsuccessful. So it's something that does need preparation and planning, but it is a powerful tool that we've been trialing and we're now looking to roll out more widely. On the left-hand side there in the middle, we undertook a review of indemnity insurance. It's perhaps not the most exciting aspect of the agenda, but it is something that can be a very significant barrier when we're asking for very high indemnity liability insurance, appropriate when we're doing a very large infrastructure contract or procurement, perhaps not appropriate when we're letting a small contract. So we really need to start varying that on a case-by-case basis as much as we can. We need to manage our own risk. So it's we can't just do away with it by any means, but we do need to make sure it's not a barrier. Yeah, sorry. The next, I'm going to hand over to Guy in a minute. The handover point is really to talk about collaboration. So, this London Anchor Institutions Network is a great example of the way in which collaboration create all the more benefits and all the more outcomes across the piece. Going to hand over to Guy now to talk a bit about measurement and I think a bit about some of the areas in which we've been collaborating as well.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. And I think collaboration is a really good jumping off point to what we're doing with you at London Institutions, which is collaborating across that traditional contract boundary that's sometimes in conflict between the public and the private sector. So I'm going to talk about delivering social value across London, but focus on how we measure social value on the basis that what you measure you can manage, and I think that's key to this. And if we can manage it, then we can optimize it and improve performance. Next slide, please, Tim. One thing just worth noting, Tim mentioned the various policies that have come out across the UK, and one in particular that I think drives everything that is all about what the industry here is doing is the Public Services Social Value Act, and that actually requires all public sector buyers to consider social value in their procurement decision making. It's been recently, or it is being reinforced by a new bill they call the Procurement Bill coming out of government now, and certainly central government has an obligation that social value has to have a minimum weighting in the procurement decision making of 10%. And when I talk about social value, it's defined as social, economic, and environmental impact. So in any other language, it's sustainability. So you could call it a Sustainable Procurement Act, but for whatever reasons, it's been called the Social Value Act in this country. So it is driving a transformation in the relationship between the public and private sector. And we sit at the nexus of that social value portal. We help unlock the social value. So we've developed a measurement framework that is then dropped into the procurement process that allows the public sector buyer to set its needs and expectations around sustainability, and then to embed that into the procurement contract. And then the bidders will bid on the core contract and the social value they're going to offer. as an additional solution to the core contract, and then we use the measurement framework and the portal to select the best social value offer that goes into the mix. And as I said, we're seeing a minimum of 10% weighting, and often a 20% weighting for sustainability or social value, which basically means that if you are bidding for work with the public sector, you must have a social value or sustainability offer within your bid. Otherwise, you're just not going to win the work with that sector. And our platform helps with measurement, procurement, reporting, consultancy, and we also have a social value academy to help upskill the supply chain. Next slide, please, Tim. We have started work, in fact, we began work some time ago with Tim and his colleagues across London. We formed the London Region Working Group specifically to look at how we could formulate a social value strategy for the whole of London, and develop a measurement framework that could be adopted by any and every council, on the basis that if you've got a unified framework that all councils are using, then it makes it much easier for the suppliers to meet those expectations, because they know what's coming and they can invest ahead of time. And so this is our working group that's not only the councils, GLA, TfL that Tim represents, but also London Fire Brigade and various others, and education as well. Next slide, please. The measurement framework sits at the centre of everything that we're doing, and it's called the National TOMS, or the National Social Value Measurement Framework. TOMS because it stands for Themes, Outcomes and Measures. And what's important about the framework is that it's built around a series of themes, 5 themes actually, that are jobs, growth, social, environment and innovation, 20 outcomes, which I'll show in a moment. But what's important about the framework, it also puts a value on the social element. So when someone is bidding for a piece of work with Tim and his team, using the portal, they will submit a quality score around social value, plus also a specific set of outcomes they're looking to achieve in terms of numbers. That is also a value. And so that is often assessed on the basis of the quality score is 50% and the social element is 50% of whatever the total social value element is, which might be 10%. So it'd be split 5 and 5, for instance. The framework has also been mapped against the global goals for sustainable development. So you can then understand how an organisation meets those wider goals. Next slide, please, Tim. Typically within the framework, this is just some of the outcomes that have been broken down. So employment for local people, investment into energy efficiency to save money in terms of energy, but also to save carbon, offer equipment to local charities, you work with community groups for sort of community projects. So we put a value to all of this. Tim mentioned in his little in the first part of this presentation, 9 billion spent. I think that was the number, Tim, that you mentioned.
Yeah.
If we were to look at the average across the portal, we're seeing around about a 20% additional social value being offered to suppliers. So that's 1.8 billion pounds worth of social value that can be delivered to the communities across London using the GLA budget of 9 billion. If you look at everything the portal has done for the past, well, since 2017, we've helped unlock 17 billion pounds worth of social value. Sitting behind that is many thousands of jobs for disadvantaged people, local spend, community projects. It just gives you the scale of the opportunity, which I think is really important. Next slide, please. I think what's really important is about needs, and this is where we're beginning to think about London. This happens to be one of the boroughs in London, and we use indices of multiple deprivation. It's a methodology that's used in England, UK, to look at how deprived an area is. And the darker purple in this is very deprived, and the lighter sort of colours are less deprived. So the darker is in the most severe across the whole of the UK, England at least, which is 10% worst. And so what this tells you is that if you are looking to deliver additional jobs, or you're looking to deliver additional social value, then if you're going to have the greatest impact, you ought to be looking for people who are living in those areas of most highest deprivation, in as much that the areas that are lower have benefit from lower deprivation or more wealthy probably don't have those same requirements. And so this gives a guide to the supplier in how they can engage with the community. I think this is really important, that we understand that social value is about understanding the need of the community and not just about just delivering whatever you think is right under your CSR program. Painting another hut for the community probably isn't as useful as providing a job for young people who are struggling to find work or mentoring in schools. Next slide, please, Tim. And so we've been working with the London boroughs to identify all of the needs across London and develop a framework. Tim has already mentioned these. So our starting point is, of course, what the Mayor is trying to achieve against these priorities around skills. And you can see those 5 themes that I mentioned actually play into these core requirements quite well. Next slide, please, Tim. And so we've actually got a list of 40 measures, but within that we've identified 6 measures that are sort of going to be a particular focus for all of the London boroughs. And these reflect Tim and the Mayor's priorities. So diversity and inclusion can be really important issue. This is not only about people who get the jobs, it's also about supporting businesses that are diverse ownerships. Second one is about good work, and it's about thinking not only about the tier 1 or the main contractor you're engaging, but also their supply chain. And this, I think, is really important. We have something called the living wage in the UK, or the London living wage. And this is about ensuring that everyone all the way down the supply chain, cleaners, chefs, get paid a proper wage, and this is something that becomes very important. So we call this is all about good work. MSME spend, so that's micro, small, medium enterprises. So real focus on how London's 9 billion can support local businesses that are small and medium and micro, because we know they are the lifeblood of any city, and so it's important they get a chance and get the opportunity. And then there's engagement for VCFE, so that's voluntary, community, faith and social enterprise. How do we engage the third sector? Through public procurement. This isn't just about the private sector getting the opportunity to deliver services for London. This is also about ensuring that we've created opportunities that are relevant and specific to voluntary organisations, community groups, and also social enterprises. And the 5th one is around zero carbon. Net zero carbon is one of the key issues that Tim has identified within London Mayor's plan. And so there's everything about exceeding that and delivering that. And the final one is around culture. Next slide, please. So what does good look like? Oh, we've got no flash. Oh, it doesn't matter. That's fine. So look, let me just summarize that for you. Oh, thank you very much, Tim. So this is just sort of how we are beginning to think about work with the public sector. Indeed, you could roll this into any organization, public or private. Start with procurement. Think about capital spend, how you embed social value or sustainability in your capital spend, how you embed it into grants if you're a city. If you're a city, you'll be also involved in planning permissions. So can you put it into the way that building permissions are granted? So can you ensure that part of your zoning and part of your permission for a developer is to deliver social value? And then finally, you've got engagement of citizens. How do you ensure that you're engaging people within this discussion? And then final piece is not forgetting that every organisation, including GLA, should be measuring its own social value, not only what it does to its supply chain, but how it employs and engages people. Thanks very much, Tim. I'll pass back to you now.
Thanks, Guy. I just wanted to kind of follow up on that last few slides and really talk about some of the outcomes, having kind of explained what responsible procurement is, and Guy's talked about how we're using social value pool, what we're doing in social value pool, and then there's themes, outcomes, measures, and the kind of principles behind that. Just wanted to give you all a bit of a few examples of some of the specifics. So I talked earlier about improving supply chain diversity. You can see here that data from recent years, we've been paying over 90% of SME invoices within 10 days, and there's a lot of evidence to sort of explain that, or sort of understand that that prompt payment is really vital for small and diverse businesses to remain afloat. Cash flow is really king for many of them. So we really endeavoured to pay those invoices within 10 days. However, as I've talked about earlier, it is really important that our larger tier 1 suppliers are following suit. And unfortunately, in the kind of infrastructure and construction sector, there is a history of sort of fairly poor practice in this of larger suppliers, of sort of larger clients pushing out payment terms to smaller businesses to 60, 90, 120 days can be enormously difficult for very small, particularly micro businesses. So again, we really need to look to our key suppliers that we're working with to share that approach, share those values. So it's something that we're monitoring. It is something now that larger businesses have to report publicly on. So we're monitoring their behavior in terms of how they're paying their subcontractors, their supply chain, and we're bringing those into contract management discussions. And we do have contract requirements saying that our suppliers need to pay their invoices within 30 days. It's not quite holding them to the same bar that we do, but it's still, kind of pushing things forward. So we're really monitoring that and ensuring that we're looking to ensure that they are behaving correctly. We've got the stat there, just over 30% of our suppliers are SMEs. However, the reality is in terms of spend, it's a lot less. So it's really only, if we look at our percentage of spend, it's really only around 5% or less. So kind of speaks to what I was talking about earlier around addressing those barriers, around ways in which we can make our contracts more available, the reserve contract piece that we've talked about. And some of the points there just on the left explain why we're doing this. The SMEs are vital to the London economy. There's small diverse businesses, but actually they're a great source of innovation, more agile and responsive supply chain. And there's a lot of overlap with the environmental agenda, because it's often the small businesses that can be the most innovative with coming up with solutions, low carbon solutions that can remove carbon, address some of that scope 3 spend. And I think traditionally it's fair to say that the public sector has not been that great at accessing innovation in its supply chain. There's a lot of requirements. There's a bit of a tendency to keep doing things the way they've been done before. So from our point of view, we do recognise that it's not something that's we can change overnight, but it is something that we are committed to improving on. And I think accessing or providing greater access to small diverse businesses to our supply chain, be it directly with us or within our larger tier ones, is key to that. Around embedding fair employment, inclusive employment practices, both Guy and I have talked about London Living Wage, a really key pillar of the Mayor's agenda. We've got upwards of 4,500 people benefiting from the fact that we require London Living Wage to be paid to us, to the workers in our supply chains, which is great, because that's actually over 4,500 people who have a material, genuine impact to their lives. It's going to have a very significant impact to them, particularly current cost of living crisis. But I think what's really good to note about this is what we've seen over the years, and this has been a policy that we've been implementing for over a decade. We've really seen a ripple effect, which was the intention of the policy in the first place. So while we can directly benefit those 4,600 people, many of those suppliers who we first required to pay London Wage to only the people working on our contracts, they've seen the benefit of that. They've seen what we say here: a diverse workforce means better decision making. So at the top there, it says living wage improves employee retention, motivation, and productivity. It's not just theory. Many of our suppliers and employers in London have seen that in reality. And they've therefore taken the choice, not a requirement from us, a choice to extend that London Living Wage payment to all of the people working in their supply chain, including contracts for other clients. And we've seen that, and we've seen businesses that are not our suppliers taking it on, largely in the banking sector in London and elsewhere. So it's really been a success story, and I think it's testament to the fact that the impact of responsible procurement is not limited just to our own immediate supply chain. It's actually that ripple effect, and that's partly the principle of the London Anchor Institutions Network that I talked about as well. Enabling skills, training, and employment opportunities. Again, this format's gone slightly askew, unfortunately, but we're creating upwards of 500. We did 633 supply chain apprenticeship starts per annum. We're doing quite well in terms of ethnic diversity. So almost 50% of apprenticeship starts were from people from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background. The London population is around 40%. So we've done well in that area in our aspiration to match or exceed the diversity of London. However, as you can see from the other statistic, we've got quite a long way to go. Quite a long way to go in terms of gender representation. So we continue to push in both areas and in other areas as well. And one of the things that we do in this space is not just including contract requirements for our suppliers to do these outputs, to create apprenticeship starts and other outputs. But we've collaborated with large tier ones as well as with the Job Centre Plus, Department for Work and Pensions, a large network of charities and employability groups that we work with. And each year we host a series, we sort of hold a series of pre-employment programs. And in these, we pull together 3 or 4 suppliers who commit to offering work placements of 2-week duration. And those are preceded by 2 weeks of pre-employment training in partnership with the college. That's drawn down from the central adult education budget. So TfL and GLA Group, we're not funding these programs, and our suppliers have not been contractually obligated to be included in these programs or to participate. This is an optional collaboration activity, but it is mutually beneficial for us. It's really creating the social mobility and addressing the diversity within our supply chain and for the suppliers. It's a much needed source of recruitment in a time when it's very difficult to recruit, and of course they do see the benefit, the reputational benefit of being alive with these programs. So we've had no shortage of suppliers who, as I say, very much optionally willing to be involved in these programs. We've had some great success in bringing people who've been long-term unemployed, people with quite significant barriers to employment into our supply chain. There's some great case studies as well. Finally, I just wanted to just talk about a few key challenges for the future, a few things that aren't kind of done and dusted yet because we're still quite new to them. And one is around our low emission vehicle program, which we're working with on Electronics Watch and a number of other procuring authorities across Europe. And the premise of this is that London is going to move to electric buses. Well, London has a bus fleet of around 9,000 vehicles, 9,000 buses. And we're looking to electrify all of those buses by 2034, and ideally pulling that earlier as funding allows. So that's very significant, but as some of you may be aware, there's some quite significant human rights issues around electric vehicles, particularly around the batteries and semiconductors. And that's in the mining of the rare earth metals and other substances that are key to the creation of these batteries, as well as all the batteries we use in our mobile phones. We'll talk about mining in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Chile, and other parts of the world. And there is well-documented human rights, unfortunately, human rights abuses. And it's the kind of thing where it's actually very difficult for us to have knowledge of what's going on in the mining. We feel quite far away. There's a number of different stages in the supply chain between us and where, say, lithium is being mined, and it's difficult for us to have any leverage. The premise of this program is collaborating with a range of public authorities so we can add our spend together. Electronics Watch is something they've already been doing with desktop electronics and hardware. They're expanding recently into this program around electric vehicle batteries. So it's quite an exciting program. It's a really challenging area. It's not something we're going to solve overnight. It's not something we're going to solve alone. It's not something we're necessarily going to solve entirely collectively, but we're really hoping to make inroads, starting with transparency, then moving on to material impact and changes and improvements in human rights conditions. We've had some good engagement so far. It's not, it's certain fear of closed doors everywhere you go, but we've had some really good engagement, both from our suppliers, but also from the wider industry and from some of the sort of groups down the supply chain. So that's we're sort of in year one of an initial 3-year project. So as I said, I didn't want to present that as a case study, but just wanted to talk about it because it's something quite innovative and kind of quite exciting. The other thing in that space is we've included a commitment in our implementation plan for all last mile deliveries to GLA Group buildings, to include a requirement from contracts let from 2025 onwards for these to be zero emission. So from 2025 going onwards from there, we're going to be including a requirement in contract for all of our final deliveries to our sites, and that's all underground stations, depots, head office sites, a large number of sites across London, to be electric, zero emission, essentially. That's kind of quite push forward. I know it's a little bit of work, or some of this has been done in some cities like Copenhagen and Oslo, but it's we're really going to kind of push forward in this. So really pulling together the approach. The key is market communication as early as possible. So we're going to be undertaking that in the first part of this year to really communicate to the market this upcoming requirement, and really put in place the support that's available with this. But it's an ambitious program, but key to both addressing the commitment for London to be zero carbon by 2030, but also the air quality, which is a key issue and concern in London. So final slide now for me. I just wanted to reflect a little bit for those of you in the audience who may be wanting to embark upon a responsible procurement or social value program within an organization, might be quite early doors or perhaps a bit further into it. Just some thoughts on kind of what you should look out for. Early consideration is essential. I don't think that's limited to responsible procurement. I think successful procurement in general is probably earlier the better. A lot of the most effective stuff is bedded in procurement strategy or when you're developing the specification. So it is really important to consider responsible procurement as a core part of a procurement and not just as an add-on a bit further down the line. Understand the market, and again, that's a key part of good procurement in general. But where do the risks and opportunities lie? And we do undertake our responsible procurement program on the basis of those two things. Some aspects of the program are risks that we need to manage. So I think the modern slavery and ethical sourcing agenda is a good example of that. It's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we are managing those risks and mitigating them wherever possible. On the other side is opportunities. So things like creating skills and employment outcomes, and that sort of thing. So it's sort of worth looking at it that way. The other two watchwords for the way we do things are relevance and proportionality. Relevance is key to keep within the procurement regulations. We need to make sure that what we're doing is relevant to the contract. The procurement regulations will be changing next year, so there may be less of an issue. It's not a blocker in any way. It was thought of such, when people started first working on this sort of work quite some time ago. It's not a blocker in any way now, but it is important to consider. And proportionality really speaks to the fact that you don't want to overload smaller value contracts with large number of requirements, particularly when you are letting higher value and particularly longer term contracts. You can put a lot in there, and you just need to make sure that it is proportionate. Contract management is key. There is a tendency, I think, sometimes to spend a lot of time and effort on the formal procurement process, including requirements or questions and tenders, evaluating them. You only get the results, you only get the outcomes at contract management stage. So you really need to avoid let and forget. In large organizations, it can be the case that it moves from a contract management is not done by the procurement teams. There can be a separation of understanding. So really try to avoid that as you set up a program, perhaps. Collaboration, relationship management. I've talked about a few instances here, I think, where working with suppliers is key. It's sometimes there can be adversarial relationships, but this responsible procurement, social value agenda, it's absolutely key to collaborate both with your tier ones, but also with peer organizations. And I think that's one of the main principles of the SPP and the chapters as well. So I think collaboration is key, and you can do so much more when you do collaborate together. Having the right leadership in place is really important. So sort of finding that golden thread from the policies and strategies or the core values and commitments of your organization through to the activity that we're undertaking. And finally, report outcomes, publish case studies, publish reports, take up speaking opportunities if they're offered, and celebrate success. That's really important for morale and for momentum, and to keep the internal stakeholders on board with what you're doing. So a few reflections from me. I think that's the final one. I think we're moving on to any questions and discussion now.
Wow, thank you both. That is so much information to actually absorb and take in, and it's fantastic to hear just how much progress London has been making, and also how it's been measured and actually tangible outcomes as well, and driving a real difference for there. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box. I will start with a few, and Seb and I will go through the ones that we have so far. Okay, so just one first of all, really, just to start off, because we have a number of people. The UK chapter covers across both private and public sector that we have. So just a question really to both of you, because I'm interested in seeing how we can take really key lessons learned or key actions that you've reflected upon there, and what can the private sector take and learn from what you've talked about today, because this is about creating social value for us all and moving us all forward, and it's applicable for both private and public sector. Are there key activities to create? What would you recommend? Where should they start?
Should I come in with some thoughts?
Go for it, Tim.
Yeah, so I think I probably just kind of continue slightly banging the drum I've been banging already, which is that collaboration piece. And I think for the private sector, perhaps the takeaway could be be willing to collaborate with your peers. I think that's not always easy by any means. And this shouldn't necessarily be viewed as a competitive area. When we've had some examples where we've let frameworks, so we've got multiple suppliers onto a framework, and we've had some really good instances of where we've been able to convene groups to look at some specific areas of our agenda, and people are willing to sort of set aside those traditional kind of competitive approaches with some of their peers and traditional competitors, and create some really positive stuff, create some really positive collaboration. So I think we do endeavour to collaborate in the public sector with our peers. We've got a number of different networks that we do that through. We've heard the plea over the years from our suppliers saying, please be more consistent across clients in terms of the reporting that you're asking for, in terms of the requirements. And we do endeavour to do that. Increasingly, I'm sure that we still could be better. So perhaps that might be my suggested lesson for the private sector, to consider things a bit more in that way.
Cool. Guy, you're on mute.
Basic mistake. Yes. So it is normal or traditional for the private sector to, I think, as a knee-jerk, say they don't have anything to learn for the public sector. I've worked on both sides and now spend a lot of time in the public sector, and I think there are some real lessons to be learned. I actually think that the public sector is doing more on social value than the private sector is doing at the moment. And what I mean by that, certainly in procurement, of course, suppliers are delivering as a result of public sector buying, but I can probably count on one hand the private sector suppliers that are properly embedding social value asks into their own procurement. And I think there are a few out there, but those are exceptions. And I think there's something around transparency for the supply chain and being clear that, in terms of the award, 20% or 15% is around social value, and that you stick to that rather than fudge it. And of course, in the public sector, there is no fudging allowed, because the award criteria and the reasons for award have to be published. In the private sector, there's no obligation for transparency. So I do think there's a real opportunity there for the private sector to learn from the public sector around those issues.
So could you share if there are any other links that either of you are able to share in the discussions or afterwards? I'd love to be able to share them with our LinkedIn group and everything within our UK chapter, and just help some of that cross knowledge going across to the private sector as well.
Yeah, lots of case studies. Yeah.
Guy, you mentioned there that there's a lot of work obviously happening on the public procurement side of things. And Tim, obviously you've spoken a lot to what's happening in London. Are either of you aware of work that's been going on from a sustainable procurement standpoint in other cities around the world that you could share?
So I can certainly talk to public sector. So we've got our public sector chapter event happening at 8 o'clock tonight GMT. If anyone wants to join, for some reason we've been put in Americas, and that's because my co-chair is Rachel Emos, who's from Canada, and so we've got a number of speakers from Canada, from various other places, and indeed, not earlier today we heard from someone from Bangladesh. So there's actually quite a lot happening, Seb, around the world. It's not called social value at all. When you say social value outside of the UK, they look at you fairly blankly, to be honest with you. It is called sustainable procurement, but we've heard from some great examples of stuff happening in Holland, across Bangladesh, I mentioned, in Canada, in France, European continent as a whole. There's some really interesting stuff happening. I think UK is unique around social value element, and I think we are first and foremost in that particular race. But some good examples coming out of our work with the public sector chapter.
It's interesting that it's known as social procurement elsewhere, because a lot of other places and countries that I've worked with, social procurement refers heavily to the environmental side and less on the social value. So bottom line is, as long as we're all still working towards it and trying to create that value, it doesn't really matter what the name is, does it?
Yeah, Joe, I've learned that is forget worrying about the names. As long as you know where we're going, that's the important thing.
Indeed. Okay, we had some other questions which have come in as well. How is social value quantified or valued to reflect the local needs in London? So, Guy, I think you touched upon this a bit, but could you
Yeah,
maybe?
I briefly touched on it, and then Tim can probably talk about the process that sits behind it. But in terms of the valuation, so we, in the UK at least, we work with government numbers that come out of it, and we pick up sort of savings to the government purse, as they're called fiscal savings. So, for instance, if you are providing a job to someone who's long-term unemployed, there's benefits that would normally be paid to them when they're not working that effectively are a saving, and that drops into part of how the valuation is done. And then we also pick up the economic benefit of that individual now having money in their pocket that they can spend locally that they wouldn't have otherwise. So you've got fiscal plus economic elements that we bring into the TOMS measurement framework, and then you can then begin to. You could also think about putting a value on well-being, but that has to be a separate sort of type of number that you add in. But nonetheless, that's how it's done, and those could be tailored for particular regions. So, for instance, providing a job to an ex-offender, you have to look at the probability of someone reoffending, and those reoffending rates are different in London than the Northeast, for instance. And so you pick up those differences in how you calculate the number.
And some of those publicly available, or are they just available through the social value portal?
No, they've all, a lot of them are publicly available. So the methodology is published through the Green Book. And so anyone can sort of calculate them. The TOMS is, I mean, you can get on and you can download, well, you can see the freemium version of the TOMS, and you can pick up the values there anyway, so you can see what's used. But otherwise, the Green Book, which is a UK government document, shows you how to calculate these things.
Let's see if we can share the links with those involved afterwards, perhaps.
Yeah.
Great.
Another one.
Go for it, Seb.
Sorry, I was going to say, Tim, did you want to add anything on the last one?
So we've got the London TOMS guys talked about. I mean, other than that, of course, when it comes to environment, we talk about reporting and CO2 saved, challenging, as many people know, of course, measuring and then measuring reductions in Scope 3 carbon is difficult, but it's something that we are endeavouring to take. There are different tools and different approaches to doing that. We haven't plumped on one yet in GLA, but we are actively working on that space. Other than that, we can report those outcomes in terms of things like apprenticeship starts, people benefiting from living wage, as we talked about. Case studies really important. I'll actually just try and put a link into some case studies that we produced previously. We do those for two reasons. One is to sort of demonstrate the fact that what we are doing, and two is to give people an opportunity to see that and replicate that should they be interested. So that is part of the purpose again.
And Joe, do you mind if I just jump in very quick? I think what's important about the numbers is that the value themselves is just, in a way, when you tell someone the value of something, like I've just said that we could unlock £1.8 billion worth of value for Tim across his procurement. I mean, beyond me saying it, it's uninteresting. It's interesting because it tells you the scale. What's really important to the mayor is how many jobs, how many tons of carbon, the actual numbers that sit behind it is the most important thing, because that then links to lives and changes that are made. But the big number is only about scalability. It's just helping you understand that procurement has a massive opportunity here in the public sector space.
And are those numbers reported on year-on-year differences as well, or sort of a 3 or 5 year trend by the mayor, or is it just every year?
Tim can answer that.
We do year-on-year trends. It varies. I've just put a link into the chat there for some case studies, the section case studies. We do have a responsible procurement report. It's a bit more sober, so I tend to promote the case studies because they're a little bit more accessible and readable. Our report is a little bit less exciting, but it is important for that kind of understanding what those core deliverables are and those year-on-year trends. And we will be issuing another report later this year, and more case studies sooner than that, in fact, as well.
Great, thanks. Another one that we've got come through. Does promoting supply diversity include supporting social enterprises and charities as suppliers? That was a question that came through from the audience.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, and it's probably an apology for me for not really saying VCSEs more clearly. But if you open up our strategies or policies, we talk about VCSEs in more or less the same breath as we talk about small and diverse businesses. So there's a little bit of an omission in my presentation, but absolutely that is part and parcel of the agenda. And when we're looking at addressing barriers and bringing more small and diverse businesses into our supply chains, those voluntary community sector organisations are part of that also.
Brilliant. Right. Well, I think on that note, although there are more questions, we will try and respond to the questions in our LinkedIn group. We have two options now because of time and because there is so much jam-packed, fantastic information being shared today as part of this World Sustainable Procurement Day. We are out of time on this platform, but we will be available now. All four of us are going to transfer over to our UK booth. You will find it either in the link that I've put in the chat, or if you navigate back through to the lounge, and then you will see chapters that way. If you just want to come and say hello, introduce, find out any more about any of our chapters, is the public one that Guy's running or the UK one, or talk more about this topic, we're available there. I would just like to thank you very much for everybody who has attended. Guy, Tim, thank you both so much from us as well. Any other questions, please do reach out. We have the LinkedIn UK group. I've put the link in there. Come and join us there as well. We would love to have you participate and do more and share more information with you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank